The autumn wind swept across the volcanic plateau of the Golan Heights, carrying with it a chill that seasoned soldiers would later remember for the rest of their lives. In October of 1973, this contested strip of high ground became the stage for one of the most lopsided armored engagements in modern military history. What began as a coordinated Syrian assault involving more than 1,000 tanks would end within 72 hours, with entire battalions reduced to smoking wreckage. Some Syrian tank units, according to post-war analyses, experienced casualty rates approaching 90%. Understanding how this happened requires stepping into a landscape where terrain, technology, doctrine, and human judgment collided with devastating consequences. To grasp the scale of what unfolded, one must first understand the Golan Heights themselves. The plateau rises sharply from the Sea of Galilee, a natural balcony of basalt and volcanic rock overlooking the fertile plains of northern Israel. Its ridgelines are steep, its wadis deep and treacherous, and its network of dirt tracks winds through terrain that appears open on a satellite map, but hides countless dead-ground pockets when viewed from a tank commander's cupola. For decades, this ground had been fortified, mapped, and studied by Israeli armored crews who trained on it repeatedly. Every ridge had a designated firing position. Every valley had been ranged. Israeli tank commanders knew where a T-55 or T-62 would appear before its crew even realized they had crested the horizon. Facing them, on the morning the offensive began, stood a Syrian armored force of extraordinary size. Documented sources placed the initial assault wave at roughly 1,400 tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, artillery regiments, and air defense systems that would have overwhelmed most defensive positions in the world. Against this force, Israeli defenders on the Golan front fielded fewer than 200 main battle tanks, most of them upgraded Centurions known locally as the Sho't Kal. The numerical disparity was staggering, more than 7-to-1, and by any conventional calculus, the defensive line should have collapsed within hours. Yet within days, it was the attackers whose formations had disintegrated, and it is the reasons behind that disintegration that reveal how catastrophic the campaign became for the crews inside those T-55 and T-62 hulls. The story of that reversal begins with equipment. Syrian armored forces were built around the T-55 and the newer T-62, both of which represented mature Soviet armored design philosophy. The T-55 was compact, mechanically robust, and relatively simple to produce and maintain. The T-62 introduced a larger, 115mm smoothbore gun, capable of firing armor-piercing fin-stabilized rounds with substantial penetrative power on paper. Both vehicles had low silhouettes, an advantage in the open-steppe warfare Soviet doctrine had been designed to fight, and their sloped armor offered reasonable protection against contemporary threats. On specification sheets, they looked formidable. If this analysis is helping you understand the tactical and technical realities behind one of the most studied armored engagements in modern history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more military history content reach viewers who care about the details, and it allows us to continue producing in-depth analyses like this one. Now, let us continue. Against these Soviet-designed vehicles, the Israeli Centurion was, on paper, an older and heavier platform. It had been developed at the end of the Second World War and had been in service in various forms for nearly 3 decades. Yet Israeli engineers had transformed the Centurion through a program of relentless modification. The Sho't Kal variant carried the British L7 105mm rifled gun, a weapon that combined excellent accuracy with a family of ammunition types, including armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds that could defeat T-55 and T-62 armor at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. The Israelis had also replaced the original Meteor petrol engine with a Continental diesel, improving reliability, reducing fire risk, and simplifying logistics. The fire control system, though not yet computerized to modern standards, incorporated stabilization improvements and gunnery refinements that made first-round hits at long range dramatically more likely than they were for Syrian crews using standard Soviet pattern equipment. The gap in gunnery capability, according to numerous post-war technical assessments, was among the decisive factors of the campaign. Israeli tank crews trained to engage targets at 2,000 meters and beyond, deliberately building their tactics around the L-7's long-range accuracy. The T-55's 100mm rifled gun, while capable, was married to fire control equipment that made accurate engagement beyond 1,500 meters considerably more difficult. The T-62's smoothbore had greater theoretical range, but its ammunition and fire control combination, in the hands of average crews, rarely produced the kind of long-range lethality that Israeli tanks demonstrated. On the open ground of the Golan, where sightlines frequently exceeded 2 kilometers, this difference translated directly into who fired first, who hit first, and who survived. Yet equipment alone does not explain casualty rates approaching 90%. The difference was compounded, and in many ways defined, by doctrine. Soviet-derived armored doctrine, which Syrian forces had absorbed through training programs and advisory relationships, emphasized mass, momentum, and centralized control. Formations were expected to advance along predetermined axes, execute assigned missions, and rely on higher command echelons to adjust the plan. Junior officers were not encouraged to deviate from orders, and platoon-level initiative was discouraged as a matter of doctrine. In the specific context of an attack against prepared defensive positions on unfamiliar terrain, this doctrine proved catastrophic. Documented engagements show that Syrian tank columns advanced along the same axes repeatedly, even after leading elements had been destroyed. Reports from Israeli tank commanders describe wave after wave of T-55s appearing at the same crest, at the same range, with predictable timing. Israeli gunners, occupying pre-surveyed firing positions on reverse slopes, engaged the advancing formations with methodical efficiency. Ranges had been paced out in peacetime training. Ammunition had been staged. Crews knew exactly which target belonged to which tank in their platoon. The result, according to after-action analyses, was engagement rates that Israeli veterans themselves later described as almost mechanical, tank after tank appearing in the same window of sky and being struck within seconds of exposure. The terrain multiplied every tactical error. The Golan Heights offer numerous ridgelines that appear traversable from below, but expose vehicles to enfilading fire when crested. Syrian columns, advancing in the mass formations their doctrine required, would climb these ridges and find themselves silhouetted against the sky, exposed to Israeli tanks that had been waiting in hull-down positions for hours. In one documented sector, which post-war accounts would come to call the Valley of Tears, an Israeli armored brigade with fewer than 100 operational tanks held its ground against Syrian formations that numbered in the hundreds of vehicles. When the fighting subsided, the valley floor was reportedly littered with more than 250 destroyed Syrian armored vehicles. The Israeli brigade, though battered and reduced to a handful of running tanks by the end, held its line and became the subject of study in staff colleges around the world. Crew training compounded the doctrinal problem. Israeli tank crews were, by regional standards and by any objective measure, exceptionally well trained. Reserve crews were composed of civilians who nonetheless maintained skills through repeated exercises on the very terrain they would defend. They knew which rocks marked which ranges. They knew which wadis provided covered withdrawal routes. Loaders drilled to the point that gun cycling times were reduced to the physical limits of the vehicle itself. Commanders and gunners cross-trained on each other's positions, allowing crews to continue fighting after casualties. Reports from Israeli veterans consistently emphasize that gunnery was practiced not just as a mechanical skill, but as a decision-making discipline. Target priority, ammunition selection, engagement sequence, and post-engagement displacement were rehearsed until they became reflexive. Syrian crews, by contrast, faced structural obstacles to that level of proficiency. Training cycles were shorter. Live fire opportunities, according to analyses of the period, were less frequent. Crew stability, the practice of keeping the same 4 men together over long periods to build cohesion, was inconsistent. Perhaps most significantly, the Soviet-derived training model emphasized adherence to procedure over adaptive problem-solving. Under peacetime conditions, this produced tank crews capable of performing scripted evolutions competently. Under the chaotic conditions of a modern battlefield, where every plan disintegrates within minutes of first contact, the same crews often lacked the training foundation to improvise effectively when their leading elements were destroyed and their prescribed axes of advance became killing zones. The night factor deserves separate attention. Syrian forces launched significant portions of their offensive during nighttime hours, and the T-55 and T-62 were equipped with active infrared night vision equipment. In theory, this offered a substantial advantage against defenders operating in darkness. In practice, active infrared systems require the tank to illuminate the target with an infrared searchlight, which is invisible to the naked eye, but glaringly obvious to any observer with corresponding infrared equipment. Israeli tanks, equipped with their own passive and active night vision systems, could detect the Syrian searchlights from far greater ranges than the Syrian crews could see the Israeli tanks. According to numerous accounts, Israeli gunners would engage Syrian tanks by aiming at the source of the infrared beam, effectively using the enemy's own night vision equipment as a targeting beacon. Syrian formations advancing at night, believing themselves cloaked by darkness, were in fact making themselves more visible to defenders who exploited every technological quirk to their advantage. Communications and coordination further compounded the imbalance. Syrian armored formations relied on relatively rigid command structures, with orders flowing down from brigade and division headquarters through prescribed channels. When leading elements encountered unexpected resistance, the time required to relay accurate battlefield information upward, generate revised orders, and disseminate them downward often exceeded the tactical decision cycle by an order of magnitude. Israeli forces, operating from doctrine that placed significant authority with individual tank commanders and platoon leaders, could adapt in seconds. A Sho't Kal commander who identified a threat could reposition his tank, engage the target, and inform his platoon leader after the fact. This delegation of tactical authority, rooted in Israeli military culture and reinforced by decades of small-scale conflicts, allowed defenders to respond to Syrian moves before the Syrian commanders themselves fully understood what was happening on their own front lines. Logistics, too, played a role that is often underappreciated in popular accounts. Israeli tank crews fought from positions that were, in many cases, within a few kilometers of resupply points. Damaged tanks could be recovered, patched and returned to combat within hours. Wounded crewmen could be evacuated and replaced. Fuel and ammunition flowed forward with reasonable reliability. Syrian formations, having advanced into contested terrain, faced far longer supply lines exposed to Israeli air attack and artillery interdiction. Tanks that ran out of ammunition or fuel became stationary targets. Crews that could not be evacuated after wounds were often lost entirely. The rate at which combat power degraded, once formations began to take losses, accelerated exponentially as logistical support unraveled behind the leading elements. Air power sits behind this analysis, rather than at its center, but it cannot be ignored. Israeli air forces, despite suffering significant losses to Syrian air defenses in the opening days, gradually established the freedom of action necessary to support the ground battle. Syrian tank formations advancing in the open on the Golan Plateau were vulnerable to air attack in ways that Israeli tanks, operating from prepared positions and often obscured by terrain, were not. The combined pressure of tank fire from prepared defenders, artillery bombardment, coordinated by forward observers who knew the ground intimately, and air attack from aircraft operating in progressively more permissive airspace, created a battlefield environment in which Syrian armored formations were being struck from multiple directions with weapons they were poorly positioned to counter. The technical characteristics of the tanks themselves deserve one more layer of examination. The T-55 and T-62 were designed around a doctrine that assumed offensive operations across relatively featureless terrain, with mass and momentum providing protection through the simple expedient of not being where the enemy was aiming. The vehicles were low, compact, and difficult targets when moving at speed across open ground. However, on the Golan Heights, where terrain forced advancing tanks to slow, climb, and expose themselves to observation from prepared positions, the low silhouette advantage evaporated. A hull-down Sho't Kal, showing only its turret over a ridgeline, presented a smaller target than a fully exposed T-55, climbing the opposite slope. The exchange, engagement by engagement, favored the defender in a way that no amount of numerical superiority could easily correct. Anti-tank guided missile employment further complicated the Syrian effort in ways that are often misunderstood. Syrian forces deployed significant numbers of AT-3 Sagger wire-guided missile systems, both vehicle-mounted and infantry-carried, which had proven devastating in the parallel Sinai campaign against Israeli armor caught in the open. On the Golan, however, the Sagger's effectiveness was blunted by several factors that analysts have documented in the years since. Israeli tank commanders, informed by the experiences of their Sinai counterparts, adopted rapid displacement techniques that made the 15-second wire guidance flight time a serious problem for missile operators. Suppressive machine gun fire from tank coaxial weapons and from supporting infantry disrupted the concentration required by Sagger gunners, who had to keep their optical sights on the target for the full duration of the missile's flight. The Golan's broken terrain also limited the clear firing lines the Sagger needed to reach its maximum effective range, forcing operators to engage from closer distances where their exposure to defensive fire was correspondingly greater. The role of artillery in shaping the engagement deserves consideration as well. Israeli forward observers, deployed with the defending armored formations, had spent years registering artillery targets across the plateau. When Syrian formations advanced through pre-registered zones, they encountered coordinated artillery fires that could be shifted onto them within minutes of first contact. Syrian formations, by contrast, relied on pre-planned fire missions that had been developed based on assumptions about the pace of the advance. When the pace slowed, when leading elements were destroyed at unexpected points, the pre-planned fires often struck empty ground, while the actual advancing tanks pressed forward without artillery support. Documented after-action reports emphasize the disruptive effect of this asymmetry, which forced Syrian tank commanders to fight without the suppressive fires they had counted on to keep Israeli defenders under cover during the advance. Crew ergonomics inside the Soviet-designed tanks presented additional challenges. The T-55's turret was cramped, which limited the physical endurance of crews during extended engagements. Ammunition storage layouts, while efficient in terms of vehicle volume, created secondary explosion risks when the tank was penetrated. Documented reports describe T-55s that, when struck by armor-piercing rounds, suffered catastrophic ammunition detonations that killed the entire crew within seconds and left the turret separated from the hull. The Centurion's larger internal volume, while making the tank a bigger target, allowed for slightly better ammunition segregation and improved crew survivability when hits occurred. Every design choice had trade-offs, but in the specific conditions of the Golan engagements, the trade-offs consistently favored the defender in the exchange of fire. There is a temptation, when analyzing engagements of this scale, to reduce the outcome to a single decisive factor. That temptation should be resisted. Syrian tank crews did not suffer catastrophic casualty rates because their equipment was uniformly inferior, because it was not. They did not suffer because their doctrine was absurd, because it was internally consistent, well suited to certain conditions, and had produced significant successes elsewhere. They did not suffer because the men in the tanks lacked courage. Accounts from Israeli veterans consistently acknowledge the persistence and bravery of Syrian crews who continued to advance into fire even after leading elements had been destroyed. They suffered because a specific combination of terrain, defensive preparation, gunnery capability, training doctrine, communications flexibility, and tactical adaptability came together on this particular ground at this particular moment, in a way that magnified every disadvantage into a lethal problem. The lessons drawn from these engagements would shape armored warfare thinking for decades afterward. Analyses conducted by NATO militaries in the years following identified the value of long-range gunnery, hull-down defensive positions, and the delegation of tactical authority to junior leaders as central to defensive success against numerically superior armored forces. Soviet analysts, reviewing the same engagements, drew different conclusions and set in motion programs that would eventually produce the T-72 and later main battle tanks with improved fire control, better crew survivability provisions, and modified doctrinal approaches. The engagements on the Golan became, in effect, a laboratory case that shaped tank design and armored doctrine on both sides of the Cold War divide for the following generation of armored warfare thinkers. For the crews who lived through those 72 hours, however, the analytical detachment of later study would have felt distant indeed. Israeli survivors described the engagements in terms of exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and the mechanical rhythm of firing, reloading, and firing again as targets kept appearing at the same ranges. Loaders reported blistered hands from the pace of shell handling. Commanders described losing count of engagements after the first day. Gunners reported that their eyes ached from continuous observation through optical sights that were never designed for the sustained use imposed by the situation. Syrian survivors, in accounts gathered later, described the disorientation of watching leading elements disappear in flashes of light and then being ordered to continue forward through the wreckage of vehicles that had been advancing beside them minutes earlier. The gap between doctrine as written on maps and doctrine as experienced by a tank crew in the middle of a shooting engagement is one of the enduring themes of armored warfare, and few battles have illustrated it more starkly than the ones fought on the Golan Heights in that autumn of 1973. The 90% casualty rate that some Syrian units experienced was not the product of any single failure. It was the arithmetic of many small disadvantages, compounding across every engagement, every hour, every kilometer of contested ground. Better gunnery meant Israeli tanks fired first. Better training meant Israeli tanks hit first. Better positions meant Israeli tanks were harder to hit in return. Better communications meant Israeli formations adapted faster. Better logistics meant Israeli tanks returned to combat, while Syrian tanks did not. Every one of these advantages, taken individually, might have added a small percentage to the exchange ratio. Combined across every engagement, across every ridgeline, across every hour of continuous fighting, they produced results that seem almost impossible in retrospect, and that continue to be studied in staff colleges around the world as an example of what happens when a defender's preparation meets an attacker's rigidity on ground that punishes every mistake. Weather conditions during the engagement added another layer of complexity that has been documented in numerous accounts. The autumn air on the plateau was cold, particularly at night, with temperatures dropping enough to affect crew endurance and equipment reliability. Fog and low cloud rolled across the ridgelines during certain hours, occasionally reducing visibility to a few hundred meters and forcing engagements at ranges where the Israeli long-range gunnery advantage was diminished. Yet even under those conditions, defenders benefited from their intimate familiarity with the terrain, using landmarks that Syrian crews could not identify to maintain orientation and to continue engaging targets in reduced visibility. Israeli tanks would fire at gun flashes and engine noise, at silhouettes glimpsed briefly through breaks in the mist, at targets marked by the ranges they knew from memory, rather than the ones they could observe through their sights. Syrian crews, disoriented by conditions they had not trained for on unfamiliar ground, often found themselves firing at shadows or at the muzzle flashes of tanks that had already displaced to alternate positions. The Golan Heights today remain quiet, the volcanic soil having reclaimed the shell craters and the wreckage having long since been cleared. But for anyone who studies armored warfare, the ridgelines still speak. They speak of the value of preparation. They speak of the danger of rigid doctrine. They speak of what happens when tank crews trained to think meet tank crews trained to obey. And they speak most of all of how the arithmetic of modern combat, once it begins to run against a formation, can produce outcomes whose scale defies belief until the smoke clears, the fires burn out, the recovery teams complete their sweeps, and the numbers, at last, are counted.